At my husband Robert's funeral, Father Michael suddenly stopped the ceremony. His hand trembled as he pointed at the coffin. "There's something wrong," he whispered. When he lifted the white cloth, everyone gasped. The secret Robert hid for 27 years was finally... Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. My name is Helen, and at 68 years old, I thought I understood every line on my husband's face, every sigh in his sleep, every habit that made him who he was. That cold February morning, standing in Riverside Funeral Home with 200 people watching Father Michael's face drain of color, I realized I'd been married to a stranger for nearly 3 decades. Let me paint you a picture of who I was before that moment. I was the woman everyone in Fairfield, Connecticut called when they needed help. For 30 years, I worked as a pediatric nurse at St. Mary's Hospital, holding crying babies and reassuring, terrified young mothers. I was the one who organized meal trains when neighbors got sick, who volunteered to teach Sunday school even when my own faith wavered, who spent entire weekends baking for church fundraisers without anyone asking. When Robert and I married in 1996, I was already 41, what people called a late bloomer. He was 43, a construction foreman with calloused hands and the kindest brown eyes I'd ever seen. We met at my nephew's wedding, where he was fixing a broken door as a favor to the venue. He made me laugh so hard I spilled red wine on my only good dress, then spent the rest of the night trying to help me clean it while telling horrible construction jokes. I knew within a month that I'd marry him. Our life together wasn't glamorous, but it was ours. We bought a 3-bedroom colonial that needed everything fixed, and Robert renovated it room by room with his own hands while I painted and decorated with finds from yard sales. We had 3 children in quick succession, surprising everyone including ourselves. Michael Jr. came first, then Sarah, then Tommy. I remember Robert crying when each was born, this tough construction worker weeping like a baby himself, whispering promises to each child about the life he'd give them. I sacrificed without thinking twice because that's what you do for love. When my mother died and left me $80,000, I immediately put it toward our mortgage and the kids' college funds instead of opening the small bakery I dreamed about since childhood. When Robert's company downsized and he was unemployed for 8 months, I worked double shifts while pregnant with Tommy. My feet so swollen I had to wear men's shoes. When Robert wanted to care for his ailing mother at home instead of assisted living, I quit my supervisor position to help, giving up a pension that would have set us up comfortably. But I never resented any of it. How could I? Robert was the man who surprised me with fresh flowers every Friday for 27 years, even when we could barely afford groceries. He never missed a single parent-teacher conference, even if it meant losing pay at work. When I was diagnosed with breast cancer 5 years ago, he slept in that uncomfortable hospital chair for 3 weeks straight, learning how to change my drains and measure medications like he was studying for the most important test of his life. The congregation at St. Matthew's Catholic Church saw us as the golden couple, the ones who'd found love later but made it count. Young couples asked us for advice. Our children's friends called us mom and dad. My sister used to joke that Robert had ruined her standards because no man could measure up to how he treated me. So when Father Michael's voice cracked and he stepped back from the coffin that February morning, when his usual composure shattered and he looked at me with something between horror and pity, I felt the entire foundation of my world begin to crack. Our mornings had become a sacred ritual that I thought would last until one of us drew our final breath. Robert's internal clock was more reliable than any alarm. At exactly 6 a.m., I'd hear his feet hit the floor, the same creaky board by his side of the bed, announcing the start of another day. By 6:15, the rich aroma of Colombian coffee would drift up the stairs, the expensive kind he insisted on buying even when money was tight because he said I deserved the best every morning. He'd bring me my cup prepared exactly right. 2 sugars, a splash of cream, and the blue mug Sarah had made in her high school pottery class. We'd sit on our back porch regardless of the season, though in winter we'd bundle up in the matching flannel robes the kids had given us for Christmas. The bird feeder I'd installed for his 70th birthday had become the center of our morning entertainment. Robert had memorized every bird type, their habits, their songs. He'd narrate their visits like a sports commentator, making up ridiculous backstories for the regular visitors. "There's Cardinal Stevens again," he'd say, pointing at the red bird we saw daily. "Looks like he's having marital problems. See how Mrs. Stevens is giving him the cold shoulder at the feeder?" I'd laugh every single time, even when the jokes were recycled from the previous week. That was the magic of Robert. He could make the ordinary feel special just by paying attention to it. Our routine extended beyond mornings. Tuesdays meant grocery shopping together at Morton's Market, where Robert would sneak chocolate bars into the cart when he thought I wasn't looking. Wednesdays were for his bowling league with the guys from work, and I'd use those evenings for my book club. Though we'd always meet back home by 9 to watch our crime shows together. Thursdays, he'd help at the church food pantry, loading heavy boxes even when his back acted up, never complaining. Saturdays belonged to our grandchildren. We had 5 between our 3 kids, Michael Jr.'s twins, Sarah's 2 boys, and Tommy's newborn daughter. Robert had transformed his workshop into a wonderland for them, building elaborate wooden toys that would last generations. He'd spend hours teaching the older ones how to use tools safely, his massive hands gently guiding their small ones. I'd watch from the kitchen window while making lunch, seeing him demonstrate the same patience he'd shown our own children. Sunday dinners were an institution. By 2 p.m., our dining room would be chaos. Kids running everywhere, adults trying to have conversations over the noise, the kitchen producing dish after dish of comfort food. Robert would stand at the head of the table, carving whatever roast I'd prepared, telling his famous construction stories. The one about the time he accidentally built a closet door that opened into the neighbor's apartment. The one about finding a family of raccoons living in a mansion's attic. Stories I'd heard so many times I could recite them myself, but I'd still laugh because his joy in telling them was infectious. Our evenings were quieter, but no less precious. We developed a rhythm of comfortable silence, him in his recliner reading historical biographies, me on the couch with my mystery novels. Every so often, one of us would read an interesting passage aloud. At 9:30, Robert would stand, stretch, and announce it was time for our evening constitutional, a walk around the block that took exactly 20 minutes. We'd hold hands like teenagers, waving at neighbors, stopping to admire Mr. Peterson's roses or chat with Mrs. Chen about her new grandson. Before bed, Robert would check all the locks twice, a habit from his construction days when he'd learned how flimsy most home security was. He'd stand in our bedroom doorway and say the same thing every night. "Another good day with my best girl." I'd respond, "The best is yet to come," and he'd grin like I'd said something brilliant. This was the life I thought we'd built together. Predictable, comfortable, filled with small acts of love that added up to something beautiful. 3 weeks before Robert's sudden heart attack, the first crack appeared in our perfect routine. So small I almost missed it. It was a Thursday evening, and I'd come home early from volunteering at the hospital to surprise him with his favorite dinner, pot roast with those little potatoes he loved. His truck was in the driveway, but when I called out, no answer came. I found him in his workshop, but something was different. The door was locked. In 27 years of marriage, through raising 3 children who were constantly trying to sneak into Daddy's workshop, through neighborhood kids wandering over to watch Mr. Robert build something magical, that door had never been locked. I knocked, and there was a scrambling sound inside, like things being quickly hidden. When Robert opened the door, his face was flushed, and he was blocking my view inside. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, but his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Didn't expect you home so early." "I wanted to surprise you with dinner," I said, trying to peer around him. "What are you working on that needs the door locked?" He laughed, but it sounded forced, unnatural. "Oh, you know me." Starting your anniversary present early this year. Can't have you spoiling the surprise like you did last year when you accidentally found that jewelry box I was making. Our anniversary was 4 months away, and I hadn't accidentally found anything last year. He'd left it on the kitchen table with a bow on it a week early because he couldn't wait to give it to me. But I let it go, kissing his cheek and heading back to the kitchen, though something cold had settled in my stomach. The next morning, our coffee ritual felt different. Robert kept checking his phone, something he never did during our morning time. When I asked who was texting so early, he said it was his foreman about a lumber delivery, but it was Saturday. Construction sites didn't take deliveries on Saturday, and Robert hadn't worked as a foreman for 3 years since his retirement. When I pointed this out, he blinked rapidly, then laughed and said he meant his old foreman was asking advice about a problem. The explanation came too quick, too rehearsed. Later that week, I woke at 2 a.m. to find Robert's side of the bed empty. I found him in the kitchen, whispering urgently into his phone. The moment he saw me, he ended the call abruptly. "Who calls at 2 a.m.?" I asked, genuinely concerned someone had died or was hurt. "Just Jim," he said, referencing his younger brother in Florida. "He's been drinking again, you know how he gets. Wanted to talk through some stuff." I nodded sympathetically, but something felt off. Robert's phone screen was still lit up on the counter, and I could see the call duration, 2 hours and 13 minutes. Jim had never been a talk-on-the-phone person, especially not for 2 hours. And Robert seemed wide awake, not like someone who'd been roused from sleep by a crisis call. The locked workshop door became a pattern. Every evening after dinner, instead of settling into his recliner with his biography, Robert would disappear into the workshop for hours. When he'd emerge, he'd smell of sawdust, but his hands were clean. Too clean for someone who'd been working with wood. Once I brought him fresh coffee and found him shoving papers into a drawer so forcefully he tore one. His face went white when he saw me, like I'd caught him doing something terrible. "Just blueprint stuff," he mumbled, "boring technical things." Robert hadn't read a blueprint since retirement, and his hands were shaking. I started noticing money things too, small withdrawals from our joint account, $200 here, $300 there. When I asked, he always had explanations. New saw blade, special wood order, supplies for projects. But the workshop didn't have any new tools, and his wood stack looked the same as always. Each incident alone meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern I couldn't ignore, like a familiar song played in the wrong key. This was Robert, but it wasn't. My husband of 27 years had become someone I didn't quite recognize. I became an expert at explaining away what my heart knew was wrong. Every suspicious moment, every odd behavior, every little lie. I built elaborate justifications for them all, like constructing a house of cards in my mind, fragile but somehow still standing. The human capacity for self-deception is remarkable when the truth threatens to destroy everything you hold dear. Robert was stressed about Michael Jr.'s business troubles. That became my favorite excuse. Our eldest had invested everything into a restaurant that was hemorrhaging money, and I knew Robert felt guilty he couldn't help more. Of course, he'd be distracted, making phone calls to try to find investors or solutions. Of course, he'd be withdrawing money, probably small amounts, so I wouldn't worry about him depleting our savings to help our son. This was Robert being Robert, protecting everyone, carrying burdens alone so others wouldn't suffer. When I found a receipt for a storage unit rental in his jacket pocket while doing laundry, I stood in our bedroom for 10 minutes, just staring at it. Unit 47B at Secure Store, $89 monthly, paid 6 months in advance. My first thought was to confront him, but then I remembered his mother's death 2 years ago. He'd been so broken by it, and we still had boxes of her things in our garage. Maybe he'd rented the unit to store her belongings until he was ready to sort through them properly. Yes, that made sense. Robert processed grief slowly, privately. This was just his way. The $5,000 withdrawal from our savings account required more creative justification. I discovered it while balancing our accounts. a task I'd always handled. When I saw it, my hands trembled so badly I had to put down my coffee cup. But then I remembered overhearing Robert on the phone with Michael Jr. the week before, and Michael had been crying. Something about a final notice and losing everything. Robert would never let our son fail, not if he could help it. He just didn't want me to worry about the money or feel conflicted about helping when we had our own retirement to think about. I even explained away physical evidence. Once I found a receipt from Victoria's Garden, an expensive restaurant 40 miles away, dated on a day Robert had supposedly been helping his friend Dave repair his deck. The receipt was for 2 dinners, expensive wine. My mind immediately went to the dark place, but then I forced it back. Dave's marriage had been struggling. Robert had mentioned that. Maybe he'd taken Dave somewhere nice to talk, man to man, and was too embarrassed to tell me about the emotional conversation. Men of his generation didn't admit to heart-to-heart talks over wine. My sister Martha called one evening concerned. She'd seen Robert at the bank in the middle of the day when he'd told me he was going to Home Depot. He looked upset, Helen, almost panicked. "Are you two okay?" "Of course," I said, my voice bright and false. "He's probably just dealing with some paperwork for Michael's restaurant. You know how he hates financial stuff." But Martha wouldn't let it go. "Helen, he was at the safety deposit box area. What would he need there for Michael's restaurant?" I made up something about important documents, maybe the deed to our house for collateral, though we'd paid off our mortgage years ago. After I hung up, I sat in our living room, staring at our wedding photo on the mantel. The young couple in that picture had promised to be honest with each other, to share everything. But maybe after 27 years, complete honesty was less important than protecting each other from worry. I even started lying to myself about my own observations. When I'd catch Robert staring into space during dinner, his fork halfway to his mouth, lost in some troubling thought, I'd tell myself he was just getting older, more contemplative. When he started taking long drives alone on Sunday afternoons instead of watching football with Tommy, I convinced myself he needed space to think about retirement, about getting older, about becoming a grandfather for the 5th time. The truth was, I was terrified. Terrified that if I pulled on any of these loose threads, our entire life would unravel. The day after what was supposed to be Robert's funeral, I couldn't stay in our empty house. The walls seemed to echo with lies I hadn't yet discovered. I needed to be in his workshop, to smell the sawdust and lemon oil, to feel close to whatever remained of the man I thought I knew. The February cold bit through my coat as I walked across our frozen backyard, using the spare key hidden under the painted rock Robert had made with our granddaughter Emma. The workshop was exactly as he'd left it 3 weeks ago, the morning before his heart attack. His coffee mug still sat on the workbench, a ring of dried coffee at the bottom. His reading glasses were folded neatly beside a half-finished birdhouse. Everything seemed normal, peaceful even. I ran my fingers along the smooth wood of his latest project, tears blurring my vision. Then I noticed something odd. The tool cabinet had been pulled away from the wall slightly, just a few inches, but enough to seem intentional. When I pulled it further, a manila envelope fell to the floor. It had been taped to the back of the cabinet. My heart pounded as I picked it up. "Confidential" was written across it in Robert's distinctive handwriting, the same writing that had penned love notes and grocery lists and birthday cards for nearly 3 decades. Inside, I found a different universe. The first document was a bank statement for an account at First National, account number ending in 8847. Robert and I banked at Citizens United, had for 20 years. This account showed a balance of $327,000. My legs gave out, and I sank onto his workshop stool. That was more money than we'd ever had at one time in our entire marriage. The deposits went back 5 years, irregular amounts ranging from $5,000 to $15,000, sometimes monthly, sometimes with gaps. No clear pattern, no explanation. The withdrawal history was even stranger, large sums transferred to another account I didn't recognize. some checks written to R. Matthews, a name that meant nothing to me. Beneath the bank statements were property deeds, one for a cabin in Woodstock, Vermont, purchased 8 years ago for $200,000 cash. The buyer was listed as Robert James Anderson, my Robert. The property tax bills showed it had been maintained all these years, payments made faithfully every quarter from that secret account. There were utility bills, too, showing regular usage. Someone had been living there, or at least visiting regularly. My hands trembled as I found the next document, an insurance policy for the Vermont property, listing a beneficiary, Rebecca Matthews. That name again, but this time with a relationship indicated daughter. Daughter. The word hit me like a physical blow. We had Sarah. Tommy had just had a daughter, but Robert didn't have a daughter named Rebecca, except apparently he did. The photograph was at the bottom of the envelope, as if it had been hidden even from the other secrets. It was recent, taken in front of the Vermont cabin. Robert stood with his arm around a woman who looked to be about 50. She had his eyes, his stubborn chin, his distinctive nose that Tommy had inherited. She was smiling at the camera while Robert looked at her with an expression I'd only seen him direct at our children. Pure paternal pride and love. On the back, in his handwriting, Rebecca and me. Summer 2020. Finally making things right. Summer 2020. I was in chemotherapy, poisoning my body to live while he was in Vermont with a daughter I never knew existed. I remembered that time. He'd said he was helping his brother Jim with renovations. I'd been so grateful, telling everyone how wonderful Robert was to help family while I was sick. I'd even sent cookies with him for Jim, chocolate chip, made despite my nausea because I wanted to thank Jim for giving Robert a break from caregiving. There were more papers beneath. Medical insurance cards with Rebecca's name listing Robert as the policyholder, dating back 5 years. Cell phone bills showing hundreds of calls between Robert's phone and a Vermont number. 5 years of systematic deception, documented and filed as carefully as our tax returns. I sat in that cold workshop until my fingers went numb, surrounded by the tools of a craftsman who had built an entire secret life with the same precision he used to build furniture. My hands shook uncontrollably as I entered the Vermont address into my GPS. The 2-hour drive from Connecticut to Woodstock stretched before me like a journey to another planet. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. Not my children, not my sister, not even Father Michael, who'd been calling to check on me. This was something I had to face alone. The February roads were clear, but my mind was a blizzard of questions. Every mile took me further from the life I thought I'd lived and closer to the truth Robert had hidden. I stopped twice to vomit on the side of the highway, my body rejecting this new reality as violently as my mind was. The cabin was beautiful. That was the first cruel detail. It was exactly the retirement dream Robert and I had planned together. A log cabin with a wraparound porch, smoke rising from a stone chimney, nestled among pine trees with a view of the mountains. We'd spent countless Sunday mornings circling listings in real estate magazines, planning for someday. Apparently, Robert's someday had already come. I sat in my car for 10 minutes, gathering courage. Finally, I walked to the front door and knocked. The woman who answered was the one from the photograph, but in person, the resemblance to Robert was devastating. She had his exact way of tilting her head when curious, the same slight squint when focusing. "You're Helen," she said softly. "Not a question. I've been expecting you since I heard about Dad's death. I'm Rebecca." "Dad?" She called him Dad. The word hung in the air between us like an accusation. "Please, come in," she said, stepping aside. "We need to talk." The cabin's interior was warm, lived in. Family photos covered the mantel. Rebecca with 2 teenage children, Rebecca in a wedding dress with Robert walking her down the aisle, Rebecca's college graduation with Robert beaming beside her. An entire life documented and displayed. Rebecca poured coffee with hands that trembled like mine. Then she sat across from me and began talking. He married my mother, Patricia, in 1968. He was 20. They had me a year later. Mom died in a car accident when I was 3. Dad couldn't handle it. The grief, raising a baby alone, the bills. His sister Grace took me in, and he left. Sent money but never visited. For 37 years, I didn't see him. I stared at this woman, Robert's ghost in her features. When did he come back? 5 years ago. He showed up at my door crying, said he'd been diagnosed with something that made him realize he'd wasted his life avoiding his biggest regret. He begged for a chance to know me, to know his grandchildren. My kids, Ethan and Olivia. They'd never had a grandfather. My husband had died 2 years before from cancer. Cancer. 5 years ago, when I'd been diagnosed. He came every month, Rebecca continued, sometimes twice. Always had elaborate stories about business trips or helping relatives. He paid for Ethan's college, helped me keep this cabin after my husband died, taught Olivia to drive. He was trying to be the father he never was. Did you know about me? My voice came out strangled. Rebecca nodded, tears flowing freely. He talked about you constantly. How wonderful you were, how guilty he felt. He said you'd survived cancer and he couldn't burden you with his past mistakes. He was going to tell you after you hit 5 years cancer-free. He wanted to bring us all together, make one family. She stood and retrieved a box from a cabinet. He wrote you letters every time he visited, never sent them, but couldn't stop writing them. He wanted to explain everything. The box contained dozens of letters, all addressed to me, all unmailed. The top one was dated just 2 weeks ago. My name in his handwriting blurred as tears filled my eyes. There's more, Rebecca said quietly, about the money, where it came from. Dad said you deserved to know everything, that secrets had already cost him one family and he couldn't lose another. But first, you should know, he loved you. What we had here doesn't diminish that. He loved you enough to hate himself for lying to you. Rebecca pushed a thick folder across the table, her face grave. Dad made me promise that if anything happened to him before he could tell you, I should give you this. He said you deserved the whole truth, not just pieces. The folder was labeled Full Disclosure in Robert's handwriting. Inside, the first document made my blood run cold. It was a confession, signed and notarized, detailing 20 years of embezzlement from Davidson Construction, where Robert had worked as senior foreman. The amounts were staggering. Nearly $500,000 taken through inflated supply orders, ghost subcontractors, and kickbacks from vendors. Oh God, I whispered, my vision blurring. He was a thief. Keep reading, Rebecca said gently. It gets worse, but also different. The next document was a blackmail letter from Gary Davidson, the company owner, dated 5 years ago. Davidson had discovered the theft but offered Robert a deal. Pay back double the amount, $1 million, and Davidson wouldn't press charges or tell me. The letter was cruel, specific. Your wife's a respected nurse. Your kids are building careers. Do you want them knowing their father is a common criminal? Pay up, or I destroy your entire family. But there was more. Robert had discovered Davidson was using his embezzlement as a cover for his own massive fraud. While Robert had stolen $500,000 over 20 years, Davidson had embezzled over $2 million, attributing the losses to Robert's theft in the books. There were forged documents with Robert's signature, fake vendor accounts Robert supposedly controlled, but that actually led to Davidson's offshore accounts. Your father figured this out? I asked Rebecca. She nodded. 3 years ago, but by then Davidson had him trapped. If Dad exposed Davidson, he'd still go to prison himself, and Davidson made sure Dad knew he'd take you all down with him. So Dad kept paying, kept quiet, and started documenting everything. The folder contained meticulous records, bank transfers showing Davidson's money laundering, emails where Davidson discussed framing other employees, recordings of Davidson threatening Robert's family if he stopped paying. Robert had built a complete case against Davidson while simultaneously documenting his own crimes. There was another revelation. Our son, Michael Jr.'s restaurant troubles weren't random bad luck. Davidson had sabotaged him, having health inspectors make surprise visits, spreading rumors about food poisoning, even paying someone to leave terrible reviews online. It was leverage to make Robert find money faster. "Dad remortgaged your house," Rebecca said quietly. "Took out 3 loans against his life insurance, sold tools, family heirlooms. He even convinced Michael Jr. to invest $50,000 in a fake supplier company. That money went straight to Davidson." I found the loan documents. Our house, which we'd paid off 10 years ago, now had a $200,000 mortgage. The life insurance I was counting on for security was gone, borrowed against repeatedly. Even Robert's father's watch, the Rolex he'd inherited and treasured, had been sold. "But why support you, too?" I asked Rebecca, struggling to understand the full picture. "He wasn't just supporting me. He was hiding assets here. This cabin, the accounts in my name. He was trying to preserve something Davidson couldn't touch, something for all of you after he was gone. He knew his heart was failing from the stress. He'd been having small attacks for months, refusing to see a doctor because he needed to finish gathering evidence first." The final document in the folder was dated the day before Robert's heart attack. It was instructions for me: how to contact the FBI, which agent to trust, where he'd hidden backup copies of evidence, and how to protect our family's remaining assets. At the bottom, he'd written, "Helen, I became a criminal trying to provide for our family, then became Davidson's slave trying to protect you from my crimes. But Davidson made one mistake. He hurt our son. That I cannot forgive. Use this evidence. Save our children. Save yourself. I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to tell you while I was alive. You deserved a better husband. All my love, Robert." The systematic destruction of our life suddenly made sense. Robert hadn't just been keeping secrets. He'd been fighting a war I never knew existed. I made it back to my car before the breakdown hit. Sitting in Rebecca's driveway, surrounded by the peaceful Vermont woods, I screamed until my throat felt like shattered glass. I pounded the steering wheel until my hands bruised, then collapsed against it, sobbing so hard I couldn't breathe. 27 years. 27 years of living with a stranger who wore my husband's face. Every memory felt poisoned now. Our wedding day. Had he already been married before when he promised to forsake all others? When our children were born, did he think about Rebecca, abandoned at 3 years old? All those nights he held me through chemotherapy, whispering that everything would be okay. Was he planning his trips to Vermont between my treatment sessions? I thought about the small sacrifices that seemed so meaningful at the time. The anniversary dinner we skipped because money was tight. Except it wasn't tight. He had hundreds of thousands in secret accounts. The vacation to Italy we never took because Robert said he couldn't leave work, but he could leave for Vermont every month. The bedroom furniture I'd wanted to replace for 10 years, making do with the creaky bed frame because Robert said we should save for the grandkids' college funds, while he was hemorrhaging money to a blackmailer. My mind spiraled through darker revelations. The night sweats Robert had blamed on age were probably anxiety about his crimes. The weight loss I'd attributed to his new health kick was stress eating him alive. The way he'd started saying, "I love you" more frequently in the last year, which I'd found romantic, was guilt speaking. Even his increased church attendance, which I'd admired as spiritual growth, was probably desperate prayers for forgiveness. I drove home on autopilot and wandered through our house like a ghost haunting my own life. In our bedroom, I stared at his pillow, still indented from his head. He died in our bed, clutching his chest, looking at me with eyes full of something I'd thought was love, but now recognized as regret. His last words were, "I'm sorry, Helen, for everything." I thought he meant sorry for dying, for leaving me, but he'd meant so much more. I pulled our wedding album from the shelf, flipping through pages of lies. There we were, cutting the cake, Robert's smile bright and genuine. Or was it? Had he been thinking about Patricia, his first wife? About the daughter he'd abandoned? Every photo became suspect. Christmas mornings with our children? Was he comparing them to the Christmases Rebecca never had? Teaching Michael Jr. to ride a bike? Did he remember missing that milestone with Rebecca? The cruelest part was the good memories. Because despite everything, Robert had been good to me in so many ways. He'd held my hair during morning sickness with all 3 pregnancies. He'd learned to braid Sarah's hair from YouTube videos. He'd built Tommy a treehouse that was still standing, still used by our grandchildren. He danced with me in the kitchen just last month, singing our song off-key while dinner burned. How do you mourn someone who never existed? How do you grieve a marriage that was built on fundamental deceptions? I wasn't just crying for Robert's death. I was mourning the death of every certainty I'd had about my life. The faithful husband, gone. The honest partnership, never existed. The secure retirement, stolen. The role model father, a fraud who abandoned his first child. I found myself in his workshop again at midnight, destroying the birdhouse he'd been building. I threw it against the wall, watching it splinter, then destroyed another, and another. All these beautiful things he'd created with hands that had signed fraudulent checks, that had taken money meant for other families, that had hidden evidence of an entire other life. By dawn, I was empty, sitting among the wreckage of Robert's projects, surrounded by splintered wood and broken dreams. I felt hollowed out. The woman who'd trusted completely, loved unconditionally, and believed wholeheartedly was gone. In her place sat a stranger, just as Robert had been a stranger. We were quite a pair. 2 people who'd shared a bed for decades without ever really knowing each other. At 3 a.m., 3 days after discovering the truth, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by the debris of my former life. Bank statements, loan documents, blackmail letters, and photographs covered every surface. I'd been sitting there for 6 hours, paralyzed by the magnitude of what Robert had left behind. My children had been calling, but I couldn't face them yet. How do you tell your kids their father was both a criminal and a victim? How do you explain that their college funds came from stolen money, that their childhood home was now collateral for blackmail payments? I picked up the photo from Rebecca's folder. Robert with her children, his other grandchildren, at what looked like a birthday party. He was wearing the same pink shirt I'd bought him for Father's Day. The smile on his face was identical to the one he wore at our grandson Tyler's baseball games. These children called him Grandpa. They had inside jokes with him, memories, traditions I knew nothing about. Something shifted in my chest. It wasn't forgiveness. I wasn't ready for that, might never be, but it was clarity. I looked at my reflection in the dark kitchen window. The woman staring back had survived breast cancer, raised 3 successful children, saved countless sick babies during 30 years of nursing. I'd been strong enough to build a life with Robert. I was strong enough to rebuild without him. More importantly, I looked at the evidence spread before me and saw what Robert had seen. Davidson hadn't just destroyed our family. The documents showed at least 6 other employees who'd been blamed for discrepancies Robert had created. One man, Thomas Chen, had been fired and arrested, though charges were later dropped. His wife had left him. Another, Maria Santos, had her nursing license reviewed because Davidson claimed she'd been stealing supplies she'd requisitioned for a company health clinic. She'd lost 2 years of work fighting to clear her name. Davidson was still out there, probably already looking for his next victim to squeeze. And my children, God, my children were still in danger. Michael Jr.'s restaurant was hanging by a thread because of Davidson's sabotage. Sarah worked as an accountant. Davidson could destroy her reputation with a few well-placed accusations. Tommy was applying to police academies. A father with a criminal record would end that dream. I pulled out a legal pad and began writing. Not the scattered notes of a grieving widow, but the organized planning of a woman who'd managed emergency rooms and raised 3 children. I wrote down every asset, every debt, every piece of evidence. I listed everyone who needed to know the truth, and in what order. I strategized like Robert should have from the beginning. First, I needed protection. legal protection for my family before Davidson realized Robert was dead and his leverage was gone. Second, I needed to verify Robert's evidence, make sure it would hold up. Third, I needed allies. The other employees Davidson had hurt, people with their own axes to grind. Fourth, I needed to control the narrative. This story would come out, but it would come out on my terms, in my way. I thought about Rebecca and her children, innocent casualties in this mess. They'd lost Robert, too, just when they'd found him. They deserved protection as much as my own children. And Rebecca had information, 5 years of Robert's confessions and evidence he might have shared with her. The sun was rising, painting the kitchen gold when I made my decision. I wouldn't just defend, I would attack. Robert had spent 5 years playing Davidson's game, paying him off, keeping secrets, living in fear. But Robert was gone, and I had nothing left to lose. Davidson had made a critical error. He'd left me alive, underestimating the quiet nurse who'd stood behind her husband at company parties. I stood up, my back straight for the first time in days. In the hallway mirror, I saw my mother's face in mine. She'd raised 6 children alone after my father died, never complaining, never stopping. That strength was in my blood. I picked up my phone and scrolled through contacts until I found Margaret Sullivan, the best forensic accountant in Connecticut, and more importantly, my former patient's mother. I'd saved her daughter's life 15 years ago. Time to call in a favor. The text I sent was simple. Margaret, it's Helen Anderson. I need your help destroying someone who deserves it. Can we meet today? Her response came within minutes. Name the time and place. The grieving widow was done. The warrior had arrived. Margaret Sullivan arrived at my house at 9 a.m. sharp, carrying a leather briefcase and the determined expression I remembered from when she'd stood vigil over her daughter's hospital bed. She took one look at my document-covered kitchen table and whistled low. Helen, this is... She paused, scanning the papers. This is extensive. How long have you been sitting on this? 4 days. My husband died 2 weeks ago. I found all of this after. I pushed Robert's confession across the table. He was being blackmailed. The man who was blackmailing him is named Gary Davidson. He's stolen millions and destroyed multiple families. I want to bury him. Margaret read for 30 minutes without speaking, occasionally photographing documents with a specialized camera. Finally, she looked up. This is federal crime territory, Helen. FBI, IRS, possibly SEC if his company is publicly traded. But we need more than what Robert collected. We need patterns, corroboration, and most importantly, we need to protect you and your family first. We spent the next 6 hours building our strategy. Margaret identified 3 critical weaknesses in Davidson's scheme. First, he'd been sloppy with the offshore accounts, leaving digital footprints. Second, he'd used his company email for some blackmail communications, a spectacular oversight. Third, and most damaging, he'd involved his wife's charity foundation in the money laundering, making her an unwitting accomplice. We need the other victims, Margaret said. Thomas Chen, Maria Santos, the others. Their testimonies will establish pattern of behavior. I spent the next 2 days tracking them down. Thomas Chen broke down crying when I called. He'd been suicidal after losing everything, saved only by his daughter's intervention. Maria Santos was angry, had been for years, keeping her own file of suspicious activities. Within a week, I had 6 former employees willing to testify, share evidence, and fight back. Rebecca proved invaluable. She arrived from Vermont with 2 boxes of additional documentation. Recordings Robert had made of phone calls with Davidson, photos of Davidson meeting with known criminals, even a confession Robert had recorded where Davidson bragged about his schemes while drunk at a company party. Dad was building a nuclear option, Rebecca explained. He called it his insurance policy. If anything happened to you or the kids, he was going to release everything simultaneously to the FBI, IRS, SEC, and every news outlet in Connecticut. I hired a private investigator, James Morrison, another parent from my nursing days, whose premature baby I'd helped save. He discovered Davidson's weakness, a gambling addiction that explained his need for constant money. Morrison also found Davidson's mistress, Cheryl, a woman who knew about the embezzlement and was willing to talk for immunity. The most satisfying discovery came from our forensic dive into the construction company's books. Davidson had been stealing long before Robert, using my husband's later theft as cover for his own crimes dating back 30 years. The real total was close to $4 million. I met with FBI Special Agent Patricia Wong in secret, arranging it through Margaret's connections. Agent Wong's eyes widened as we presented our evidence. "Mrs. Anderson, this is one of the most thoroughly documented white-collar crime cases I've seen from civilian sources. But you realize your husband was also guilty." "My husband is dead," I said firmly. "His crimes died. With him. But his evidence can still deliver justice. I want immunity for my family, including his daughter Rebecca and her children. I want restitution for the victims Davidson framed, and I want Davidson to lose everything: his company, his freedom, his reputation, everything." Agent Wong smiled grimly. "I think we can arrange that, but we'll need you to help us stage this correctly. Davidson can't know we're coming until it's too late to run or destroy evidence." The plan we crafted was elegant in its simplicity. We would use Robert's memorial service, the rescheduled one, as the stage. Davidson would attend, playing the supportive employer. He wouldn't be able to resist the opportunity to gauge how much I knew, to ensure his secret was safe with Robert dead. But I had one addition to the FBI's plan. I wanted the truth revealed publicly, in front of everyone who'd respected Davidson, who'd believed Robert was just a simple construction worker, who'd pitied me as the naive widow. Margaret looked at me with something like admiration. "Helen, remind me never to cross you." "I was always this strong," I replied. "Robert just never gave me a reason to show it. Davidson did." The rescheduled memorial service was set for Saturday, March 2nd at 2 p.m. 3 weeks had passed since Robert's original funeral was halted, and the entire town was buzzing with speculation. I'd carefully controlled the narrative, telling concerned friends that there had been paperwork complications with Robert's life insurance that needed sorting. Everyone accepted this explanation. Bureaucracy was something they could understand. I made sure everyone would be there. Personal calls to Robert's former co-workers, emphasizing how much their presence would mean. A notice in the church bulletin. Individual invitations to the employees Davidson had wronged, though they didn't know why I was so insistent they attend. Rebecca and her children received special invitations as family friends from Vermont. My own children still didn't know the full truth. I told them only that there were financial complications I was sorting out. Davidson called me the Thursday before the service, his voice dripping with false concern. "Helen, I wanted to check on you. This must be such a difficult time. Is there anything Davidson Construction can do for the service?" "Actually, yes," I replied, my voice carefully weak and grateful. "Would you say a few words about Robert? You knew him for so long, and it would mean so much to have his employer speak about his dedication." I could hear his smile through the phone. "Of course, Helen. Robert was very valuable to our company. I'll be honored to speak about his contributions." Valuable. Contributions. The words were perfectly chosen to seem respectful while hiding their true meaning. Robert's theft had been very valuable indeed, covering Davidson's larger crimes for years. Friday night, I met with Agent Wong one final time. She had 4 undercover agents who would be positioned throughout the church, ready to move when signaled. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit had frozen Davidson's accounts that morning, but quietly without alerting him. They'd also executed sealed search warrants at his office and home while he was at a golf tournament, copying hard drives and removing documents. The trap was set. "Are you sure you want to do this publicly?" Agent Wong asked. "We could arrest him quietly after the service." "No," I said firmly. "These people need to see who he really is. The employees he destroyed need to see him fall. My children need to understand their father was as much victim as perpetrator, And Davidson needs to feel what Robert felt. The public humiliation, the fear, the complete destruction of everything he built on lies. I spent Friday night in Robert's workshop, now cleaned and reorganized. I'd rebuilt the birdhouse I'd destroyed in my rage, understanding finally that Robert's creations weren't tainted by his crimes. They were separate, pure things, just like parts of our marriage had been real despite the lies. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzling, appropriate weather for a memorial that would become an unmasking. I dressed carefully in the black suit Robert had loved, the one I'd worn to our daughter's law school graduation. I added the pearl necklace he'd given me for our 20th anniversary. Purchased, I now knew, with stolen money, but still given with love. Michael Jr., Sarah, and Tommy arrived early to help set up. Looking at them, I saw Robert's best qualities: Michael's protectiveness, Sarah's attention to detail, Tommy's easy humor. They would survive this revelation. We all would. The church began filling at 1:30. Davidson arrived at 1:45, his wife Patricia on his arm, both dressed impeccably. He caught my eye and nodded solemnly, playing his part perfectly. He had no idea that Agent Wong was sitting 3 rows behind him, that the church exits were being monitored, that his world was about to collapse. Father Michael pulled me aside. "Helen, are you sure about this? What you're planning, it will change everything." He knew. I'd confessed everything to him the night before, seeking not absolution but strength. "Father, the truth needs light, doesn't it? Isn't that what Scripture teaches?" He squeezed my shoulder. "Then may God give you courage." At 2 p.m. exactly, the service began. In my purse, I carried Robert's final letter and a USB drive with everything: evidence, recordings, documents, proof of Davidson's crimes, and Robert's tragic entanglement. The memorial program listed me as the first speaker. As I walked to the podium, I saw Davidson lean back in his pew, satisfied, believing himself safe. He had no idea that Robert's real memorial would be his destruction. I stood at the podium, looking out at the packed church. 200 faces stared back: friends, family, neighbors, and enemies. Davidson sat in the 3rd row, his expression arranged in perfect solemnity. I pulled out a stack of papers from the box I'd carried up, letting the moment stretch until the silence became uncomfortable. "My husband lived many lives," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the microphone. "Today, I want to introduce you to all of them." A murmur rippled through the congregation. Davidson shifted slightly, his first sign of unease. 27 years ago, I married Robert Anderson, construction foreman, loving father, devoted husband. But I recently discovered I also married Robert Anderson, embezzler. Robert Anderson, father to a daughter he abandoned when she was 3. Robert Anderson, victim of blackmail. And Robert Anderson, evidence collector who documented crimes that will send several people to federal prison. The church erupted. Davidson started to stand, but his wife grabbed his arm, her face white with shock. Agent Wong moved closer to the aisle. I held up the first document. "This is Robert's confession, notarized and witnessed. Over 20 years, he stole approximately $500,000 from Davidson Construction." Gasps echoed through the church. My children sat frozen, Sarah covering her mouth, Tommy gripping the pew, Michael Jr. staring at me in disbelief. "But here's where it gets interesting," I continued, pulling out the next document. "This is a blackmail letter from Gary Davidson dated 5 years ago. Rather than report Robert's crimes, Mr. Davidson chose to blackmail him, demanding $1 million in payment. Stand up, Gary. Let everyone see you." Davidson remained seated, his face now purple with rage. "This is slander. I'll sue you for everything." "With what money?" I asked calmly. "The FBI froze your accounts yesterday. They've been investigating you for the past 2 weeks based on evidence I provided. Evidence that shows you stole over $4 million, Gary. $4 million, using my husband's smaller theft to hide your greater crimes." I pulled out my phone and played a recording. Robert's voice filling the church. "Gary, please, I can't pay any more. You've taken everything." Davidson's voice responded, "I own you, Anderson. Pay up or I'll destroy your family. That pretty nurse, wife, those successful kids, they'll all know what trash their father is." Patricia Davidson shot to her feet, staring at her husband in horror. "Gary, what have you done?" "But wait," I said, raising my hand. "There's more. Thomas Chen, would you stand?" Thomas rose from the back row, his hands shaking but his head high. "Mr. Davidson framed me for theft I didn't commit, ruined my marriage, my career." "Maria Santos?" Maria stood. "He accused me of stealing medical supplies that Robert had actually taken under Davidson's orders." 4 more employees stood, each briefly stating how Davidson had destroyed their lives while enriching himself. "Now for the twist," I announced, gesturing to Rebecca in the 5th row. "Rebecca, would you come up here?" Rebecca walked to the podium, her resemblance to Robert causing another wave of gasps. "My name is Rebecca Matthews. Robert Anderson was my father. He abandoned me when I was 3 after my mother died. 5 years ago, he found me again, trying to make amends. The money he stole? Much of it went to supporting me and my children after my husband died of cancer. He was trying to fix one sin while committing another." Davidson finally stood, moving toward the exit. "This is a circus. I'm leaving." "Mr. Davidson." Agent Wong's voice cut through the chaos as she stood, displaying her badge. "I'm Special Agent Patricia Wong, FBI. You're under arrest for embezzlement, money laundering, extortion, and blackmail." 2 other agents materialized from the congregation, moving toward Davidson. He tried to run but found the exits blocked. The arrest happened in full view of everyone, the handcuffs clicking shut, his rights being read, his wife sobbing in her pew. "One more thing," I said into the microphone as Davidson was led past the podium. "That charity foundation your wife runs, Gary? The one for underprivileged children? You've been laundering money through it for years. The FBI has those records too. Every donation, every fundraiser, all tainted by your crimes." Patricia Davidson collapsed back into the pew, realizing her life's work had been corrupted. Davidson looked at me with pure hatred as the agents paused. "Robert died carrying your secrets and his own," I told him. "But secrets have a way of surfacing. Your victims are free now. Robert's children will know their father was flawed but fought back. And you're going to federal prison where everyone will know exactly what kind of man you are." The church doors closed behind Davidson and the federal agents. I turned back to the congregation, my family, my community, all staring in stunned silence. "Now," I said quietly, "let's have a proper memorial for Robert Anderson, all of him." 6 months later, I stood in my kitchen making Sunday dinner, but the table was different now. It was bigger, extended with both leaves to accommodate the expanded family that had emerged from the ashes of Robert's deceptions. Rebecca and her teenagers, Ethan and Olivia, had driven down from Vermont, as they did twice a month now. My own children had struggled initially with their half-sister's existence, but Sarah had been the first to extend an olive branch, recognizing that Rebecca was as much a victim as any of them. The trial had been swift and decisive. Gary Davidson was serving 15 years in federal prison for embezzlement, money laundering, tax fraud, and extortion. The investigation had uncovered even more victims, more stolen funds, more destroyed lives. Davidson Construction was dissolved, its assets liquidated to pay restitution. The employees Robert had inadvertently helped frame each received compensation. Not enough to restore their lost years, but enough to rebuild. Patricia Davidson had divorced her husband and testified against him, devastated to learn her charity had been used for money laundering. In a strange twist of justice, she'd asked to meet with me, and we'd spent 3 hours crying together in my living room. 2 women betrayed by the men we'd trusted. She'd liquidated her personal assets to make genuine donations to the families her husband had destroyed, including mine. Our house was safe. The FBI's asset forfeiture team had determined that while some of our equity came from Robert's crimes, the majority was legitimate. My inheritance, our salaries over the years, the mortgage payments we'd made honestly for 2 decades. They'd allowed us to keep it, though we had to pay back $80,000. My children had pooled resources to help, refusing to let me shoulder it alone. Michael Jr.'s restaurant had recovered remarkably. Once news spread about how Davidson had sabotaged him, the community rallied. Local food bloggers wrote glowing reviews, customers packed the place nightly, and 3 investors came forward with legitimate funding. He'd hired Thomas Chen as his accountant, 2 victims of Davidson's schemes building something honest together. Sarah had taken the revelation the hardest, her faith in people shattered by her father's deceptions. But therapy was helping, and she'd channeled her anger into purpose, working pro bono to help other families untangle financial crimes. Tommy had graduated from the police academy, his father's crimes actually strengthening his application essay about understanding both sides of the law. Grandma Helen, can you teach me to make the rolls? Olivia, Rebecca's 15-year-old, stood beside me exactly as Sarah once had, eager to learn family recipes. She'd started calling me Grandma after Thanksgiving, when she'd watched me teach my other grandchildren to make pie crust using Robert's mother's technique. "Of course, sweetheart," I said, pulling out the ingredients. "Your grandfather loved these rolls. He used to sneak them before dinner." I could speak about Robert now without the rage that had consumed me initially. Therapy had helped me understand that people could be both good and bad, that love could coexist with deception, that Robert had been a coward but not a monster. He'd stolen, lied, and hidden, but he'd also loved, sacrificed, and ultimately tried to protect us in his flawed way. Rebecca joined us in the kitchen, her presence now comfortable rather than jarring. "I brought Dad's tools," she said quietly, "the ones he kept at the cabin. I thought maybe Tommy might want them, or Michael for his son." The tools were beautiful, worn smooth by Robert's hands, still sharp and well-maintained. We decided as a family to keep the good things. The furniture he'd built, the toys he'd carved, the memories that were real despite the lies surrounding them. "You know what I realized?" Rebecca said, watching her daughter learn beside me. "Dad brought us together, not the way he intended, not the right way, but still. His death revealed the truth, and the truth set us all free." I looked around my full kitchen, my 3 children, their spouses, my 5 grandchildren plus Rebecca's 2, Rebecca herself who'd become like a daughter to me. Sunday dinner required 3 chickens now instead of 1, 4 pies instead of 2, and the noise level could be overwhelming. But it was real, honest, built on truth rather than secrets. The doorbell rang and Tommy went to answer it. He returned with Margaret Sullivan, my forensic accountant turned friend, carrying a bottle of wine and her famous chocolate cake. She'd refused to let me pay her full rate, saying that taking down Davidson had been payment enough. "How's the family?" she asked, surveying the chaos with a smile. "Complete," I answered, surprising myself with the truth of it. Finally complete. Standing in my garden now, 8 months after that earth-shattering memorial service, I'm planting the rose bushes Robert always promised to plant, but never did. My hands are dirty, working the soil that will nurture new growth. It's meditative work, this planting. This creating something beautiful from bare earth. Rebecca and her children helped me design the garden. 13 rose bushes, 1 for each grandchild, including hers. We're calling it the Garden of Truth, though the grandkids just call it Grandma's Roses. The strangest revelation has been my own transformation. At 68, I thought I knew who I was. Robert's wife, devoted mother, retired nurse. But adversity has a way of introducing you to yourself. I discovered I was a strategist, a fighter, someone capable of orchestrating justice when the system failed. I found strength I didn't know existed, not just to survive, but to rebuild something better from the ruins. I'm grateful, not for Robert's lies, never for those, Not for the pain that nearly broke me or the humiliation of learning my life was partially fiction, but I'm grateful for what grew from that devastation. The federal investigation I initiated led to justice for over 20 families Davidson had wronged. The companies, liquidation funded a scholarship program for children of construction workers. Patricia Davidson and I now co-chair a foundation helping families recover from financial crimes, the real kind of charity work she'd always intended to do. My children have grown closer through this crisis. They check on each other daily, something they rarely did before. They've learned that family secrets are poison, and they're raising their children with radical honesty, age-appropriate truth rather than pretty lies. Michael Jr. tells his twins about their grandfather's mistakes alongside his good qualities. Sarah explains to her boys that people are complicated, that love doesn't mean perfection. Tommy promises his baby daughter he'll never hide who he is from her. Rebecca brought something unexpected into our lives: forgiveness without forgetting. She loved Robert despite his abandonment, understood his flaws without excusing them. Through her eyes, I learned to see my husband as a complete person, rather than just a betrayer. He was weak, criminally so, but he was also trapped in a web that grew more tangled with each desperate decision. His final act, gathering evidence against Davidson, was his attempt at redemption. Too little, too late, but still an attempt. The moral of my story isn't simple or comfortable. It's this: we often don't know the people sleeping beside us. Not really. Marriage can be a performance where both actors forget they're playing roles. But here's the deeper truth. When the performance ends, when the masks fall, when the secrets explode into daylight, that's when you discover who you really are. Not who you were as a wife or husband, but who you are as an individual human being. Robert's betrayal could have destroyed me. For a brief time, it did. But destruction can be renovation if you choose to rebuild rather than just clear the wreckage. Every lie he told became a truth I insisted upon. Every secret he kept became transparency I demanded. Every victim he created became an ally I cultivated. His weakness became my strength, not through revenge, but through refusing to let his choices define my remaining years. What would you have done in my place? Would you have exposed everything at the funeral, risking your children's emotional destruction for the sake of justice? Would you have protected the family reputation and let Davidson walk free? Would you have embraced Rebecca and her children, or seen them as painful reminders of betrayal? Can you forgive someone who lied to you for decades, even if that forgiveness comes after they're gone? Here's what I want you to consider. How well do you really know your partner? Not the surface details, their coffee order, their favorite movie, their usual excuse for being late, but their depths, their shadows, their capacity for deception, and perhaps more importantly, how well do you know yourself? What would you be capable of if pushed to the edge? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever discovered a life-changing secret about someone you loved? How did you rebuild afterward? What would you have done differently in my situation? And remember this: sometimes the end of one story, even a story built on lies, is the beginning of a better, truer one. We are not defined by what happens to us, but by how we choose to respond. We are stronger than our worst betrayals, more resilient than our deepest wounds, and absolutely capable of building something beautiful from the ashes of what we thought we knew. Don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories of betrayal, redemption, and the courage to start over. Like this video if it touched your heart or opened your eyes, and share it with someone who needs to hear that they can survive their own revelations, whatever they might be. Until next time, remember, the truth might hurt, but secrets destroy. Choose truth. Choose growth. Choose the courage to become who you really are when no one's watching. Thank you for joining me on this journey.